Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining here today. So today I'd like to talk about a new tool that I've been developing over the past year to track Amazon fires in near real time. This has been something that came forth of a long-term sort of collaboration between NASA and the University of California, Irvine. So I just moved to Cardiff University actually and have been at NASA in Washington, D.C. over the past 5 years. So special thanks also to Douglas Morton, Yang Chen, James Randerson, and Paula Brando, who have contributed to the work I'll present today. Okay, so sorry, I just needed to figure out how to go to the next slide. So just to give you a brief introduction for those of you who aren't familiar with the occurrence of fires in the Earth system and the role they play in particular ecosystems, sort of before moving on to the Amazon story. So what you see here on the top is a map of global burned area. So actually the area that burns around the world every year exceeds the size of Europe. So it's a really sort of important Earth system process. Large scale emissions, big effect on air quality, climate, and ecosystem structure around the world. Particularly what you can see here is that most of the burned areas, so like all areas that are sort of dark red in this figure, almost the entire landscape burns every year. So you can see clearly that most of that all occurs across savanna ecosystems. But fires also play a critical role in forests and unfortunately also in tropical forests. And particularly in those ecosystems I'll be talking about, those fires don't form sort of a natural part of the ecosystems as they do in savanna. So they're really problematic and cause large-scale damages to the ecosystems. So now if we look at trends, so surprisingly for many people, actually global burned areas rapidly declining. So what you see is that in many of the global savanna ecosystems, fires are disappearing from those landscapes because they tended to grow very large in the past. But now landscapes get more and more fragmented and natural vegetation is turned into cropland and grazing. And there's no place anymore for those sort of naturally occurring fires. What you can see though in this inset here is that particularly when moving into the sort of, more dense forested areas, that we do see still an increase in burned area. And that is, because in those landscapes, the fire occurrence is so closely related to sort of human land management. Sorry, I see that my video got switched off somehow. Anyway, so just to give you a little bit of an idea, so what you can see here is sort of the occurrence of on the right figure, is the occurrence of fires on the landscape and how that changes sort of when people move into those landscapes first, and then with increasing sort of intensification of the land use, so more people on the landscape and more intense use. So what we see in savanna landscapes is this sort of non-linear decline. So their fires are really disappearing at the bottom figure. And then at the figure here on the top, what you see is, sort of the classic change at the land use frontier. So obviously, if we are thinking about the tropical forest, for example, there wouldn't be any fires in those naturally. But then when people first move into those landscapes, we see this sort of huge increase in fire activity associated with the change in land use. And then after that, when the land use sort of intensifies and more people move into those landscapes, higher value crops are grown, for example, as well, then we see that fires again disappear from the landscape. So it's sort of this wave sort of shape. So now moving on to the Amazon. So there's really two things that drive fire activity across the Amazon basin. And one obviously is climate. And climate across the basin is actually very closely related to sea surface temperatures. So everybody will be familiar with El Nino Southern Oscillation. So this is a really big effect on climate in the region. But also the Northern Atlantic actually has, as this changes how far the monsoon will be moving out north usually during the dry season. So essentially it influences the duration of the dry season across the Southern Hemisphere Amazon. Um, so what you can see here on the top is a figure of sea surface temperatures. In red, the AMO, so that's the Northern Atlantic, and in blue, the Nino index. So what you can see is for 2020, today I'd really like to talk about 2020, that, it's a relatively warm year in terms of Northern Atlantic, which means more than average drought conditions across the Amazon. And this is then we create an annual prediction. So one of the nice things or interesting things about those sea surface temperatures is that they tell you months and months ahead of the dry season actually occurring, what sort of dry season it's going to be. So we can make sort of fire season severity predictions months ahead of the season actually occurring. So you can see here for Southern Hemisphere Amazon, mostly like states in Brazil, but also some countries like Peru, um, and regions of Bolivia, essentially the forecast for 2020. So they all sort of, like not all the way in the extreme, but definitely above average drought conditions that we predicted. And the figure here on the top right sort of shows you how that works. So we can see the variation in sea surface temperatures typically already during January. That then affects the precipitation during the wet season, as well the onset of the dry season, resulting in changes in terrestrial water storage and sort of moisture available across the basin. And then eventually, many months later, during August and September, in the amount of wildfires occurring across the region. Um, Now, there's one other big factor really that's super important, and that's the rate of deforestation. So what you can see here is sort of the long-term changes in deforestation rates. These are data from PRODES, so INPE, so that's for Brazil. So you can see that deforestation rates were very high in the early 2000s and then came down a lot, but over recent years they've been increasing again. And now just a short sort of background on how deforestation works. So typically deforestation occurs in rather remote places, and it's not really worth actually using most of the sort of wood, if you will, or the branches or trunks and roots. So one way to eliminate a large amount of biomass really efficiently is by burning it. So this is just here on the lower right is a high resolution satellite image of a deforestation fire. So it's not the actual forest on fire, but it's rather first like big bulldozers would move in and pile up the wood, and then they put it on fire, and that creates these sort of massive plumes across the region. So now, unfortunately, deforestation rates have been going up over recent years. So you can see that 2018 was still well below 10,000 square kilometers annually, and 2019 was already above that. And the numbers for 2020 are also not too promising, unfortunately. And that's really one of the reasons why, particularly last year in 2019, there was such an extreme interest in those deforestation fires, because the numbers had been coming down very well in the past, and it's been considered one of the big sort of, like environmental policy successes across the region. And the fact that now sort of numbers are slowly creeping up again is very worrisome. There was also another reason why those fires last year caught so much attention. And you can see that in this short video. So these are just satellite images of CO concentrations during 2019, actually, across the Amazon area. And what you can see here towards the end of the video is this big plume of CO, which is just one of the trace gases that comes of those wildfires. Carrying into the direction of Sao Paulo, thousands of kilometers away from the Amazon basin, causing really, really poor air quality. And that's sort of the moment, when the international media as well as regional, like Brazilian media started to pick up on it last year. Um, Now, following on that, so just to first to put this just in a little bit of perspective again. So this is a figure actually from directly taken from our webpage. So one way to monitor sort of the fire activity across the region traditionally has been the use of active fire counts. So active fire counts are essentially hot pixels detected by satellite. So a single fire can generate many active fire counts because as each satellite overpass, that fire will be detected as being a hot pixel or a pixel with thermal radiation. Um, but like the count really gives sort of a good idea about the interannual variability and change in fire activity across the region. So you can see that 2020 here is the dark or the greenish line um, is sort of on average compared to this long-term time series. But that said, like those like really high years, those are really the years in the early 2000s when deforestation rates were in the range of 25,000 square kilometers annually. So that's really not something we want to go back to. And the sort of more recent years are all below that curve. And now sort of, and what I really wanted to today is a new product that we developed because fire counts really do not tell the whole story and people have just been relying on those. But particularly, they don't tell you what is burning. And, it's really important to understand what is burning and why it's burning, obviously, to understand those trends across the region. Um, so generally speaking, so now I'm just talking about the new product that we have developed. There's 4 fire types that we can distinguish across the region. First of all, the fire type that I just spoke about. So these are the deforestation fires. So that's the example on the upper left here. So large field, just try, like eliminating the biomass that's there. The second fire type, and people are really worried about this fire type, it's a fire type that occurs along the edges of where people live. And these are management fires, for example, for burning pasture land or deforestation fires, or small agricultural fires that then can escape into the forest and can burn thousands of square kilometers annually. And tropical forests, unfortunately, are really poorly adapted to fire, which means that above like in the range of 50% of the trees can actually die from a fire that has such little intensity as you can see here. You can probably just jump over it, but the bark of those trees is so thin, that many trees nevertheless die. And this is a really damaging fire type that people are very concerned about, also in the light of sort of future climate change. And then finally, you have like small sort of agricultural fires and maintenance fires shown in C. And you have savanna grassland fires. And those fires, actually, we should cherish them to a certain extent because savanna ecosystems really require the occasional occurrence of fires for them to maintain sort of their open character and their natural biodiversity. Um, so now this is how that looks like from space, essentially. So all those little dots that you can see in these figures are the hotspots I was talking about earlier. So those are essentially the thermal anomalies, so the thermal radiation emitted by the fires and how we can observe that from satellite. So now in the background here, you can see the dark green is forested areas and the light areas are open landscapes. So what you can see here is the 4 different fire types and how we observe them from space. So first, the deforestation fire, you can clearly see that it's kind of a square. Um, lots of like hotspot detections, essentially. Then you can also see, so the color, sorry, that's one important thing to explain about this image. The color of those little dots or active fire detections indicate the date that they were detected. So dark blue is early and red is late. So what you can see in the second fire here, the little cross indicates the ignition location, and then that this fire has been spreading very gradually over the course of almost a month outwards to burn this entire area here within the black perimeter. Now we also have those very little fires associated with agricultural burning, for example, that would just result in or some agricultural residue burning would just result in a single active fire detection, often much smaller than the actual pixel area. And we have savanna grassland fires, and those move really fast. So what you see here is we can't observe the entire fire this way. But you can distinguish the fire line and how it's moved from one day to the next, to the next, to the next. But it takes about 12 hours for the satellite to revisit the same spot on Earth. So this is sort of the distance that the fires move during that time. But in this talk, I'm really interested sort of more in those first three fire types that tend to be associated with forest degradation. Now, to develop this product, really we used an existing algorithm that I developed previously that was called the Global Fire Atlas, that sort of tracks the development of wildfires globally. But we applied this in this time based on those active fire detections in near real time. And we combined active fire detection from two state-of-the-art new satellites, essentially Suomi MPP and NOAA 20, that have a really highly sensitive sensor to the thermal radiation that comes from those wildfires. So this algorithm, what it does is it maps the daily perimeters of the wildfires and tracks whether they are spreading fast or slow. And we now combine that, for example, with other information as well about wildfire behavior. So some of the typical, like characteristics, for example, of a deforestation fire would be that you have this big pile of biomass, and that generates like very intense fires with a lot of thermal energy coming off, typically like burning across days and days in the same spot. And then on the other hand, for example, we have those very low intensity fires creeping over the forest floor, like gradually progressing through the landscape. Very short fires, less than a day, typically burning during the daytime, for example, for some agricultural residue burning, and then savanna fires. So we really, to develop this product and distinguish the different fire types, what we did is we looked at the different characteristics of the fire behavior. And we also combined that, for example, with historic land use changes, as well as land cover information, like was it covered by forest? Was it covered by natural grassland? Has there been any recent deforestation detected by satellite? Now, to move on to the 2025 season, so this is just a map that shows you the distribution of the different fire types across the region in 2020. Just please also for the next figures, keep this color scale in mind. So the dark red colors, it approximately corresponds to the map that I created here. The dark red colors are deforestation fires. The blue colors are savanna and grassland fires. Green areas are fires occurring in forested ecosystems. And then the orange ones are those sort of very small fires that may be associated with slash and burn practice. It may also be small scale sort of agricultural residue burning. So now what we can see is that we can distinguish these different areas across the southern Amazon that sort of have different characteristics based on the climate, as well as the sort of, socioeconomic development across the region. So we have some regions where fire activity is almost entirely driven by sort of the movement of the land use frontier, so the expansion of the land use frontier. So fire activity across this region is really dominated by deforestation fires, and you can then also expect that any trend coming from that area is obviously completely dominated by that. So any sort of interannual change or long-term change will be closely associated to the expansion of the agricultural frontier. Then we have areas where we see more of a mix. So particularly here along the Chingu River in the Chingu National Park, you see those are much drier tropical forests. So there is a much greater risk of fires burning into those natural forests, essentially. That said, you need to keep in mind that all those fires, like almost 100% of them, are human caused. They are not always, meant to set those forests on fire, obviously, but the ignition source is always humans. But this is really an area that expresses a mix of expansion of the land use frontier as well as, like those fires that escape into the natural forests. And then we have those areas, particularly further south, where we get into typically, like areas with a much longer and much more intense dry season, also drier forest types, where fires, forested fires sort of really dominate. Now, in terms of management practice, of course, it's really critical to understand what sort of wildfire is burning, when and where. So, for example, it can help us to develop early warnings. When is a good time to do your agricultural burning and when is absolutely not. Also, the fact that our product is developed to detect those different fire types in near real time can help you to do something about those wildfires before they spread like tens or 20 tens of kilometers away from the nearest road, and there's absolutely nothing that can be done about them at all. So with that, I'd just like to move on to discuss like a few different regions. So this is just sort of the general time series of active fire detections across the southern Amazon in 2020. So here on the top, you can see the different contributions from the different fire types that we distinguish. And in the black line, you see the long-term average. So the satellite data we use for this exercise provides shorter time series compared to the ones I've shown before. So there's sort of early years with the very high deforestation rates are excluded from these time series. And these time series start in 2012. So actually when deforestation rates across the region were very low. So now what you can see here in the top figure is obviously like early in the season, the signal has very much been dominated by deforestation fires. Then towards the middle of September, understory fires as well as savanna fires really pick up. And then, which is also the natural course of things, during October, the fires sort of start to decline again across the region. Important to note, though, that even in October, and this is partly driven by those, by the warm Atlantic and drought conditions across the region, the fire activity was well above average. So what you can see then is that in the figure here below, if you compare the different years, is that 2020 fire activity across the southern Amazon was much higher overall actually compared to 2019, despite the fact that the fire season has received very little attention this year, obviously in part due to the COVID-19 situation. You can also see that, due to the drought conditions later in the season, fires really continued to burn, while 2019 had a really steep start, partly because of that, it got so much media attention. But then the wet season sort of started early, extinguishing many of those fires. So with that, I'd just like to move on to a couple of regions and sort of discuss, like the different dynamics, building on the figure I showed previously. So what you can see here is a map of Amazonas. So fire here appears a little less, and that's because in this figure it actually reflects the burned area. In the previous figure, I had sort of blown it up a little bit. So in these figures, it actually reflects the burned area. So you can see, obviously in Amazonas, so really, very humid systems or natural fires are barely present in these areas. So you can see that the signal is almost entirely driven by deforestation fires. So we can safely assume in this area that the 2020 uptick, as well as the 2019 uptick in fire activity across Amazonas, is going to be almost entirely driven sort of by an intensification of the deforestation process, the expansion of the land use frontier. Kind of similar for Rhodonia. So Rhodonia is just south of Amazonas. So you can also see you know, like the land use frontiers really driving with deforestation fires here in dark red is really driving fire activity across most of the state of Rondônia. In contrast, though, to Amazonas, we see that actually the fire activity and sort of, you know, like the expansion of the land use frontier um, did not really accelerate so much compared to the previous years in 2020. And now if you look just at the map of the state, and if you have an understanding of the actual protected areas like here, you know, then you know, you can also understand that, you know, like whilst respecting the protected areas, there's really not very much to further expand in across this state. So it's also partly simply you know, driven by the fact that Rondônia has seen most of its deforestation already occurring in the past and not much forest left. Now, Pará, on the other hand, is one of those states where, you know, we see a mix of fire activity. Surprisingly or interestingly, what you can see here is that 2017 was also a really big fire year on the time series here at the bottom. Presumably also due to the large-scale occurrence, since deforestation rates were quite low in the 2017. So due to large-scale occurrence of understory fires. So what you can see here in the top figure is, you know, those sort of time series again, you know, and in this region, you can really see that, you know, the sort of drought conditions have, you know, like are an important contributor to sort of the extreme, relatively extreme fire activity across 2020. Now with that, moving on into the other states where, so Mato Grosso is further south. So we see here again the Xingu area, where we still see a mix of deforestation as well as understory fires. We also see like it's 2020 has been like a really extreme outlier actually in Mato Grosso, and particularly driven by understory fires as well as savanna fires. Now, there's one feature that really sort of stands out if we look at Mato Grosso, and that's actually the Pantanal region in the south. So this is a wetland area actually that has seen really extensive fire activity in 2020. And these are just you know, some figures that are zoomed into the Pantanal. What you can see here on the right is thick smoke plumes coming off the Pantanal area during this year, earlier this year in September, you know, and they sort of all merge together and then travel south. And here on the left, what you can see is in dark and reddish colors, all the burned area. So it's really exceptional actually for the Pantanal region to have this extensive wildfires, you know, and almost 10% of the biome burned. So obviously these are not, you know, like the sort of really dense tropical forest that we see further north. It's more like open woodlands, but what open or closed woodlands actually. But what makes those fires so unique really is, you know, the fact that they occur in this wetland system and burned almost 10% of the biome, and that's really unprecedented, you know. And it's the kind of thing that we start to see more. You know, also last year, for example, in Australia, where you know, like really sort of a considerable fraction of an entire biome or ecosystem gets lost in a single year due to extreme weather conditions, essentially. So now moving on to Bolivia. So also extensive, you know, like particularly understory fires in Bolivia this year, but nowhere close as much fire activity as in 2019. And I will show in the next slide why that is. We can also see that in Bolivia, the understory fires really contributed quite a bit, burning in a considerable part of the Chiquitano dry forest in southern Bolivia. So again, these are, you know, this is an ecosystem that is not entirely unnatural for fires to occur, but, you know, like the fraction of those forests that got lost like in a single year And now particularly if we start comparing that, so this is a figure actually that shows for the same region, the combined burned area, like in green again for from understory fires, the combined burned area in 2019 and 20 from this fire type. And you can really see, just going back, these are the 2020 fires, more in this region, and then the 2019 fires here, sort of all the way along the land use frontier. A considerable part of the biome really or the ecosystem that got lost just over the course of 2 years. So it is indeed very worrisome, these sort of trends. And you have to remember that, like all those fires really originate from human activity in the end, often unintended, but there are conditions, and those conditions, one of the hopes is that now we start to understand, like when and where those understory fires occur, because we map those fires, their duration, their start, their location, that with these new data we can better, like sort of inform and hopefully both, like prevent as well as address the occurrence of those fires early on during their lifetime, before they're sort of, like once they have fire lines of 10, 20, 30 kilometers long in those remote areas, it's really almost impossible to do anything about it. So with that, I would like to move on to sort of the next part of this presentation, and that's just focusing a little bit on the tool, and what we can do with it, and what sort of our next steps are with this project. So this is just a screenshot essentially of our current webpage. So all the data are currently generated in near real time. So you can, all sort of shape files I just shown, are available at our webpage, globalfiredata.org, Amazon dashboard. But you can also explore the data online. So for example, you can select a certain state. You can see the time series of active fire detections or detected thermal anomalies actually from different fire types. But we also append a lot of other data that can be helpful for, like management purposes. For example, each of those fire polygons that's generated in near real time provides information of whether or not it was occurring in a protected area. It provides information on the location, obviously. It provides information on the fire type. So it provides information on whether the fire is still active or not. So the data is really developed to, for local agencies to be used, and we're currently collaborating with quite a few of those national as well as regional agencies on, trying to have the data used by them. So that's something that particularly closely collaborating across Brazil, but also Peru, for example. And we are thinking about expanding now the data into the Northern Hemisphere as well for the upcoming fire season there. So you can also click, for example, on the largest fires, or just explore the data in any other way on our online on our webpage, essentially. So this is just an example of a deforestation fire. So the little round dots here, indicate the thermal anomalies detected, and the red area is sort of the perimeter. And then you can see that all that information would be present, like sort of is retained in those polygons, like in the in standard sort of GIS format. So it's really easy to use. This is just an example of how you can filter, for example, for all the active fires across a region. So those are the ones marked in yellow. You can filter for all the new fire starts, which is rather important, if you want to sort of act early upon fire occurrence. So those are really tiny. So hence I draw like the large, I mean, as of yet, when I took this image, they were really tiny. They might expand into a much larger area later, obviously. So with that, I'd just like to summarize. So fire regimes are changing really rapidly in response to land management and climate. And here we developed a new tool to track and classify individual fires across the southern Amazon. So it provides new insights into the relative contribution of various fire types across the region. And there's really two sort of key objectives there. One is that we want to support sort of local fire management. So we produce the data near real time, which will hopefully allow for more targeted response and a better understanding of ongoing sort of calamities. But we also really interested in these data from a scientific perspective. For example, to better understand the sort of dynamics across different regions, thinking about the expansion of the agricultural frontier, or understand, the conditions under which certain fire types occur, which will then help to create, for example, early warning systems, or aid forecasting. Obviously, it's also really important from a scientific perspective, so one of the things we are working on as well is to estimate the carbon emissions and other emissions coming from these different fire types. And obviously, like things like deforestation fires or understory fires contribute to sort of long-term changes in the carbon cycle, while savanna fires or, small agricultural fires really, like have a sort of short-term effect. Because if a savanna burns, it will grow back the next year. So any sort of gases that are emitted might contribute to poor air quality, but not sort of to, like long-term changes in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, for example. So with that, I would like to end my presentation. I will just keep open the slides, and I would welcome questions if there are any.
Thanks very much, Niels. That was really, really interesting. I've got a question, one question at the moment, and give people some time to mull over further questions. So the question is from TC, and he says, really interesting talk. I was wondering if you've looked at the spatial patterns of fire through time. I guess my question here is, how important is the land use driver of fire frequency and area versus the climate driver?
Yeah, it's a really good question, TC, and also, obviously there's, like really different concerns as well of, the future, like particularly, in terms of climate change, people are very, very scared, about sort of those understory fire types, because, landscapes get more and more fragmented. And the combination really of that with drier climates, is driving the expansion of understory fires, and sort of fundamental shifts in the ecosystems, as well as the carbon stored, obviously, across the Amazon basin. So in terms of the drivers of trend, so unfortunately, this new sort of system we developed really depends on a combination of two highly novel satellites. So we only have data starting in 2019. I have been able to compare the data to 2019, and we actually do that in a paper that's under review currently. So I can't go back with these time series much further, but really, like just thinking about 2020 and why it's, it's the record year starting from 2012, essentially when deforestation rates were relatively low. It's really a combination this year. So on the one hand, we can see those states that have accelerating deforestation rates, particularly, Amazonas, as well as Barra. And then, sorry, not Barra, but anyway, particularly on the interior, sort of the western part of the Amazon. And then we see those other areas, more the drier parts of the Amazon, so Mato Grosso and Pará, essentially, where we see, that it was quite an extreme drought year as well. Well above average sort of understory forest fire activity. It's a combination of both. And at this point, I wouldn't be able to, like compared to 2012 and earlier years, there's a clear increase in deforestation fires and deforestation activity in general, obviously also highlighted just by the increase in the extent of deforested areas. I wouldn't be able to judge, for example, if 2020 deforestation fires were also more than 2019 at this point, though. There's no further questions. I would like to thank everybody who's been attending today, and it's really a pleasure to give this talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us, Niels. It was really, really interesting. Lots to think about, and I'm sure that we'll have some follow-up questions afterwards. So,
all right, yeah, obviously feel free to email me if you have any.
Lovely. Thank you very much,
All right.
Niels.
Thank
Okay.
you, Alice.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.